Disability Tax Credit Promoters Restrictions Act, standing in the name of Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant, seconded by Mr. McColman, moves that Bill C-462, an act restricting the fees charged by promoters of the Disability Tax Credit and making consequential amendments to the Tax Court of Canada Act, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Finance. Debate. The Honourable Member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, as the Member of Parliament for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke, it's my pleasure today to speak in support of my private member's Bill C-462, an act restricting the fees charged by promoters of the Disability Tax Credit and making consequential amendments to the Tax Court of Canada Act. My intention for bringing this legislation before the House is straightforward. I want to see increased protection for disabled Canadians from the predatory practices of some disability tax credit promoters who see the tax credit as an opportunity to profit on the reduced circumstances of others. The disability tax credit is a non-refundable tax credit that reduces the amount of income tax that either a person with a disability or their supporting person has to pay. Parliament voted in this tax credit with the recognition that Canadians with disabilities face financial challenges. Canadians may be eligible for the disability tax credit if all or substantially all of the time they are unable to perform one or more of the basic activities of daily living, even with therapy and the use of appropriate devices and medication. Basic activities of daily living include things like speaking, hearing, and eating. The wide array of disabilities eligible under the disability tax credit is important. As the Member of Parliament for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke, which includes CFB Petawawa, I'm acutely aware of the number of disabilities that Canadians are living with. The soldiers and veterans of my community are at a greater risk for a number of disabilities because of the sacrifices they make for our country, and the tax credit is of particular importance to them. For the average Canadian, the maximum federal amount that could be claimed last year was $7,341. This resulted in a maximum federal tax savings of up to $1,101 for 2011. This is significant tax relief for Canadians living with a disability, and that money should be staying in the pockets of Canadians who need it. It should not be swindled away by unregulated promoters. This tax credit is important to them. My decision to introduce the legislation restricting the fees charged by promoters of the federal government's disability tax credit is a direct result of the aggressive tactics employed by some providers who objected to my decision to issue consumer alerts. I started issuing consumer alerts last year in my riding when I found out that some individuals were being charged 20, 30, or as much as 40% of the tax credit. I felt, and I'm hoping that other members of Parliament will agree, that those kinds of charges are unfair, especially when we consider that the purpose of the disability tax credit is to support Canadians living with serious disabilities. I wanted my constituents in Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke to know that they can access their federal member of Parliament regarding any federal tax credit without being charged a percentage of the tax credit. Changes were put in place in 2005 that made benefits receivable on a retroactive basis. This created a new incentive for those claiming to be consultants to work with Canadians on their claims, as the dollar amounts on a 10-year retroactive tax refund can be significant. I started to get a sense of how big an activity this whole tax credit promoter scheme is when a promoter complained about my consumer alert by telling me that he had spent $25,000 on booking space, hotel rooms, and media coverage, and he expected to make his money back after driving the 905 kilometers to my rural Eastern Ontario riding with his traveling roadshow. His complaint was, how dare I tell the people to see their member of parliament and let them have all of the tax refund they qualified for with the disability tax credit. We're also not talking about a small number of Canadians, Mr. Speaker. The Canada Revenue Agency receives, on average, 200,000 new disability tax credit applications each year. It's estimated that approximately 9,000 of these requests are received from taxpayers who use the service of a disability tax credit promoter. Last year alone, $800 million in credits were issued. I'm still receiving phone calls and emails with complaints from these promoters. Many of the comments I have received are along the line that they're just helping our government to promote the disability tax credit, and they deserve the fees they're getting. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't disagree more. There may be legitimate companies doing this work. Unfortunately, it's the less scrupulous operators that have identified the need for the legislation that I'm proposing today. I ask all members of the House to support Bill C-462. Concerns have been raised by medical professionals who feel they're dealing with an increasing number of fraudulent claims and have at times felt pressured to fill forms out fraudulently by constituents. I know this to be the case because doctors in my riding have told me that this has been their experience. One doctor relayed the incident of having an individual sit in his office and refuse to leave until he filled out the disability tax credit certificate to get the tax credit. In the doctor's expert medical opinion, he insisted on being truthful when asked to complete the tax certificate. This same patient, who had been encouraged in this behavior by a disability tax credit promoter, was revealed to have visited 4 doctors previously looking to have the certificate completed in such a way as to qualify for the tax credit. Some consultants have even taken the step of employing in-house medical practitioners to sign the medical portion of the disability tax credit application, perhaps having only met the person just once with no prior knowledge of the applicant's medical history. So let's talk a bit about the credit. To qualify, an individual must have a severe and prolonged impairment in mental or physical functions as defined by the Income Tax Act and as certified by a qualified practitioner. Eligibility is not based on the diagnosis of any specific medical condition, but is based on the effects of the conditions on an individual over a prolonged period of time. Some examples of conditions that may qualify include walking. A person with no apparent mobility impairment who is unable to walk a short distance without stopping frequently to rest because of shortness of breath or pain may qualify for the disability tax credit because it takes him or her an inordinate amount of time. Vision may be a condition. Someone who's suffering from a degenerative condition that will not improve with the use of corrective lenses or medication and has a severe visual impairment may qualify for the disability tax credit. Hearing. A person who, even with the use of a device, is unable to hear or who takes significantly longer than an average person who does not have an impairment to understand spoken conversation may qualify for the disability tax credit. Speaking. A person who, even with therapy devices, is unable to speak so as to be understood and must rely upon other means of communications, or who takes significantly longer than an average person who does not have the impairment to make themselves understood, may qualify for the disability tax credit. This list is not meant to be exhaustive. These are just a few examples, and the information is gathered directly from the Canada Revenue Agency website. My intention in bringing the bill before the House is straightforward. I want to see increased protection for disabled Canadians from the predatory practices of some disability tax credit promoters on the one hand, and also contribute to a fair, functioning marketplace for those who do wish to use the services of a disability tax credit promoter. Bill 462 would provide a new legislative framework to limit the fees charged by promoters for the services of assisting applicants for the disability tax credit. In particular, the bill would restrict the fees that can be charged or accepted by promoters to prepare a request associated with the disability tax credit, the DTC, under the Income Tax Act. It would prohibit charging or accepting more than the established maximum fee, and would introduce offenses and penalties for failure to comply. Bill 462 would introduce a requirement that promoters notify the Canadian Revenue Agency when more than the maximum fee has been charged. The provision of the bill will come into force on a day to be fixed by the order of the Governor in Council, at which time the proposed maximum fee will be made public. This is not an attempt to crack down on those legitimately claiming the credit or to deny claims. It's an attempt to make sure those who qualify and for those who require the tax credit are able to receive it without paying unfair charges. As the Member of Parliament for a rural Eastern Ontario riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke, I understand, as does our government, that Canadians can have a difficult time making ends meet. And as a result, we offer a very generous range of credits. These tax credits are a key component of our economic action plan, a plan for jobs, growth, and long-term prosperity that's working for Canadians as we face a global economic downturn. Examples of important credits include the Universal Childcare Benefit, the Canadian Childcare Benefit, Children's Fitness Tax Credit, Children's Art Credit, Volunteer Firefighters Credit, First-Time Homebuyers Tax Credit, Public Transit Tax Credit, just to name a few. These are all credits I encourage my constituents to take advantage of if they can, and to come to my constituency office and we'll help them apply, no charge. I've spoken to the minister, and to be clear, if you qualified for the disability tax credit, say in 2007 or 2008, and your medical situation is the same now as then, you will absolutely qualify for the credit. This is about protecting Canadians from predatory and unfair practices of unregulated promoters. This credit isn't intended to line the pockets of promoters. The disability tax credit promoters are currently totally unregulated. This is producing a system that's increasingly ripe for abuse. Lawyers charge contingency fees, but they're bound by strict codes of ethics, and the bar associations carefully scrutinize actions to ensure appropriate professional ethical behavior. Perhaps most appropriate for today's discussion, tax preparers are guided by the Tax Rebate Discounting Act and capped at what they can charge for their service. An accountant can't take 20 minutes, prepare and submit your taxes, and then charge you 40% of your refund. Tax preparers also have a professional organization that promotes ethics and peer review of business practices. I chose not to set a maximum fee in the legislation because I wanted to allow for consultations with disability groups, medical professionals, and legitimate tax professionals to help inform this decision. I want to ensure that disabled Canadians who do need the help of someone with their applications can get it, and we are not imposing unnecessary red tape on doctors or legitimate tax preparers. I note that there is a rate set in the Tax Rebate Discounting Act for accountants and others that may be part of the discussion on the disability tax credit consultants. The rate under the tax rebate discounting allows for a $45 fee on the first $300 and 5% on amounts above $300. This fee level is something I would expect will be raised during the consultations. There are no similar accountability measures for the disability tax credit.
Order. The time for the first intervention, the first speech is now at its limit. We go to questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel.
The honourable member for Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel.
I want to commend the member for introducing the bill. I think it's got a good idea. First of all, I'm shocked that a Conservative is actually going to present a bill that's going to require more regulation, which I'm not totally sold on. But the quick question would be, in her act here, she says that the definition of a promoter means a person who directly or indirectly accepts or charges a fee in respect of disability tax credit. So what is the definition? Who is a promoter exactly? So is a doctor, lawyer, or an accountant considered a promoter? Thank you, Mr.
The honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's an excellent question from my colleague opposite. What we're looking at here are the third-party promoters, quite apart from the regular tax preparers, accountants. It's a new cottage industry that sprung up once the 10-year retroactive provision was made, recognizing that there are volunteer organizations and even constituency offices that do this type of work, who help constituents fill out applications for tax credits. There is a provision for exemptions so that people who volunteer their time and who do it at no charge, and to ensure that doctors as well do not fall into this, have been made. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments?
For Fort McMurray, Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I commend the member for this bill. It seems very useful indeed. Hundreds of millions of dollars going in unwarranted profits to people that would prey on the most vulnerable Canadians, and I applaud her for that, and I will be supporting this bill, and I hope all members will do that. I'm wondering why specifically she didn't set out a maximum fee in relation to the contingency fee charged. I know in Alberta there was talk of this for some period of time in relation to solicitor fees, and that was capped at 30% some time ago, about 12 years ago, from an unregulated industry, and I know that was met by much applaud in the industry in Alberta. I'm wondering if she did much research on this and why she didn't set a particularly maximum fee.
Member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my colleague for the indication that he will be supporting my bill. The reason that I didn't set a specific fee is that we want to have consultations with the tax credit promoters, people with disabilities, because some people do want that extra help apart from the regular tax preparers. We want input from tax preparers as well as accountants and medical professionals. So we'll be doing the consultations and then announcing what the fees allowable will be at that time. Thank you.
Questions and comments. L'honorable député de Saint-Maurice.
The honourable member for Saint-Maurice-Champlain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to know, the Speaker's colleague has said that the fraudsters spend hundreds of millions of dollars, rather keep them in their pockets. What I would like to know is is the percentage of disabled people who are entitled to a tax credit and who are the victims of such fraud?
Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I made reference to the tax promoter that said he had spent $25,000 on promoting. Now, in reference to the question on what number of people are eligible, CRA says that 200,000 new applications are received on a yearly basis. Insofar as what number of people are swindled or how much it goes to the tax preparers, we don't know because it's totally unregulated. And that's why we're putting these provisions in place so that we can keep track and ensure that the tax promoters are being fair to Canadians living with disabilities.
Time for one short question. The honourable member for Brant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first of all want to commend my fellow colleague on introducing this bill. Many of the people in Parliament actually have spent a lot of time with persons with disabilities, and of course we quickly realize that they are the most vulnerable, and this bill drives at protecting and making sure the most vulnerable are not taken advantage of, and I commend her for that. My question has to do with the services that she provides in her constituency office without, I would think, any additional staff than would normally be in an office, and how many constituents avail themselves of that service.
Member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke, a short response, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Brant for seconding my bill and for all the work that he has done throughout his lifetime in helping people with disabilities. In terms of my office, we do keep statistics, but now that the disability tax credit, the profile has been raised, we're receiving more people. So on a weekly basis, we would probably see anywhere from 80 to 100 people, and of that, maybe 20% on taxes, again, depending on the season. And we help on a number of occasions with people getting their disability tax credit, and it can amount to the tens of thousands of dollars if it's on a retroactive basis.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak on Bill C-462, and I acknowledge that this bill was sponsored by the member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke, and I'd like to thank her for her work on this important issue. I will be supporting this bill because, like the member, I believe it's necessary to establish limits on the maximum fees charged by promoters of the disability tax credit. However, Mr. Speaker, it's my view that a study is needed to clarify certain sections of the bill and to provide insights on how certain shortcomings of this bill might be best addressed. Speaker, in my community of Victoria and across the country, many of our fellow citizens are living with disabilities, and many simply don't have access to the supports that they need. I'd like to stress that for people living with disabilities, some of the biggest issues relating to the disability tax credit are simply not addressed in this bill. The application process for the tax credit is not transparent, and people with disabilities have trouble obtaining it. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to see more information in advance on the way in which this bill would be implemented and how the public will be informed as to its existence and to the protections it creates. I'd like to see a simplification of the application process for the disability tax credit to make it more accessible for people with disabilities. And I'd like to see better protection against financial abuse and restrictions on fees charged by promoters of the disability tax credit. Now, disability organizations such as the Council of Canadians with Disability, the Canadian Association for Community Living, and a myriad of organizations that represent specific disabilities share our concerns about access to the disability tax credit. And it's my sincere hope that the Conservative members on the other side of the House will consider carefully the concerns that I and my NDP colleagues on this side of the House are bringing forward. and I hope that the necessary changes can be made to fill in some of the gaps in this legislation as it's currently drafted. I think in this context, it would be most appropriate for me to talk a little bit about my concern about the Conservative government's cuts to the Canada Revenue Agency that have had a real impact on the services offered to all Canadians. Cuts to jobs and duties of regional program advisors, for example, put information sessions on disability tax credits at risk. These sessions facilitate the understanding of how to obtain the disability tax credit. And, of course, closures of CRA offices across this country have had a significant and ongoing impact on persons with disabilities who need access to the services provided by those centres. Following major Conservative cuts to the federal headquarters, I understand that some 28 Canada Revenue Agency counters were closed last fall. And, Mr. Speaker, I think there is a fundamental issue to speak to on this point and a very serious question to ask. If the CRA services were readily available for people with disabilities, and if the process for accessing the disability tax credits were not so onerous in the first place, would the need have been created, which certain unscrupulous advisors have been induced to meet? In other words, if the forms in the statute were less opaque, the bill may not have been necessary, which of course is regrettable. Mr. Speaker, I think ultimately this should be approached as an issue of accessibility for people with disabilities. Ensuring accessibility is the work of so many incredible groups across the country. For example, in my riding of Victoria, I would particularly salute Inclusion Works, a family grassroots-oriented group that recently won an award from the BC Ideas Competition for Social Innovation and also won both the People's Choice Awards and Supporting People with Developmental Disabilities Investment Awards. Now, in our view, the priority in order to ensure that persons with disability have equal access to disability tax credits should be to ensure that promoters cannot abuse the system. With this, I agree with my honourable colleague. Persons with disabilities must receive the support that they need. Unfortunately, this bill doesn't address the problem of such accessibility. The CRA administrative process remains complicated and the tax credit difficult to obtain, especially when a person is not familiar with the application process. Now, it is necessary, we agree, to establish limits on fees charged by promoters of this tax credit. A promoter, in quotes, is defined as a person who directly or indirectly accepts or charges a fee in respect of a disability tax credit. Now, I have concerns about this broad definition. It may be over-inclusive. For example, people accepting nominal gifts for their assistance would be caught by this definition. Now, we are not against all promoters. Some act as consultants to help people with disabilities obtain services and tax credits from the government they'd otherwise not know how to obtain. But we have serious concerns about what is a trend among less scrupulous consultants that seek to profit from a change in eligibility criteria. Following the 2005 changes to the criteria, and specifically when the government started to offer retroactive tax refunds, promoters started to offer their services to taxpayers to help them maximize their refunds. And there have been problems. An article on February 9th, 2011 by the CBC exposed some of the abuses that people are suffering and to which my honourable colleague alluded, I think, quite clearly. So I have serious concerns about the situation as well. It's my understanding that the bill prohibits promoters from accepting or charging a fee that exceeds the so-called maximum fee. Now, I think it's important to clarify in committee just how and when maximum fees will be established and how the public's going to be informed about them. I'd like to know how the Governor and Council will determine the maximum fee. Unless otherwise exempted, promoters charging more than that fee will have to inform the Minister of the fees charged. Now, how will promoters know what the maximum fee is and how will they be made aware of the changes? And what kind of promoter will benefit from an exemption? What are the criteria for such exemptions? Is there a danger of too broad a discretion being conferred on officials by this form of drafting? Similarly, is the formula for calculating the promoter's fee, as set out in Section 3, Sub 2 of the bill, square with the fine set out in Section 7. I would like to know if the government has thought of clarifying the application process for the DTC, the Disability Tax Credit, in order to address the real issue of accessibility and unnecessary complications associated with the current process. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I would like to say that I will vote to support the bill and hope that the necessary changes I've alluded to will be made to fix the problems with it, and I will work to encourage those changes. But I return here to my initial point. It appears to me that in conjunction with these legislative changes, government cuts to the CRA are creating a need for greater assistance and refusing to address the fundamental problems of accessibility to the disability tax credit. I'd like to state again that we are not against promoters. We recognize some act as consultants and help people with disabilities to obtain the services and tax credits from the government they'd otherwise not know how to obtain and to which they are entitled. However, we do need to fix some of the fundamental problems that are creating this situation, and I believe that this bill in its current form fails to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saint-Léonard, Saint-Michel. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you for allowing me a chance to speak. Basically, I'm going to read the title because I think it's important to put the debate in context. And it says, this enactment restricts the amount of fees that can be charged or accepted by persons who, on behalf of persons with disability, request a determination of disability tax credit eligibility under the Income Tax Act. It establishes a prohibition against charging or accepting more than an established maximum fee and establishes offensive and penalties for failure to comply. So based on that, I don't see how anybody can be opposed. I think right off the bat I can say that I'm comfortable with it, and I'll be supporting the bill to send it to committee. And the Liberal Party has always supported cracking down on fraudulent consultants who take advantage of disabled Canadians, or any type of Canadians, but especially disabled Canadians. However, we have problems with this bill, Bill C-462, which we think requires careful study at committee to ensure that it achieves the stated objectives and avoids unintended consequences. We
support the idea of capping the maximum fees in order to help protect eligible claimants who are applying for this tax credit, but the maximum amount of these fees should be determined through an open and transparent process involving the consultation of the relevant parties, for example, disabled persons associations and medical personnel. Therefore, we must adopt a rigorous approach in order to ensure that disabled Canadians receive as much assistance as possible. We support Bill C-462 at second reading to send it to committee so it can be studied to ensure that there are no unforeseen consequences, for example, a reduction of the eligibility for the tax credit on the part of the disabled persons. We also hope that the government will show good faith and listen to the members of the opposition in order to make the necessary amendments to the bill as necessary. The only way of avoiding the regrettable consequences for disabled people is to work seriously in committee, and I do hope that the Conservatives will set aside partisanship for such an important topic. Despite the bill's good intentions, I think that the government could help Canadians more, disabled Canadians more, by simplifying the application process for this disability tax credit. For example, the documentation to fill out for the application process is complicated. Physicians have a great deal of responsibility in this case, which means that many Canadians are unable to fill it out without assistance. Many disabled Canadians should be able to fill out this form on their own, because this means that they would not have to resort to other people to help them. This could also lead to savings for the government by reducing paperwork and red tape and the time it takes to process these files. It would thus be a good idea for both the disabled Canadians and the government to study this avenue during committee work. The Liberal Party also supports the fact that fraudulent consultants should be prosecuted to the letter of the law.
The bill, and I just want to quickly highlight some of the few concerns that I found in looking at the bill. In the bill, it states that the definition of promoter means a person who directly or indirectly accepts or charges a fee in respect of a disability tax credit. So would that mean a doctor and accountant? I asked the question to the sponsor of the bill, and she seems to think that it wouldn't be, but that's not what the bill says. So I just want to make sure that the bill will be corrected so that doctors and or accountants or other professionals will not be included as being promoters. 7 out of the 8 pages, I was looking at the requirement to fill out the disability form. It's a request of 8 pages. 7 out of the 8 pages of the form to request or to determine if you're eligible to claim the disability tax credit must be completed by a qualified practitioner, which means a medical doctor, physiotherapist, optometrist, psychologist, occupational therapist, special language therapist, audiologist. So I don't think any of these should be considered promoters. So again, are the doctors consultants? Are they promoters? Should the doctors not charge for their time? That's the other question. Some doctors do charge for their time, or is it part of the medical services they provide through the healthcare system? So this is, I think, one of the questions that should be asked to committee. I understand there are going to be some medical professionals and associations and representatives, so that would be one of the concerns I would find. I also find that in my experience as an accountant in my former life, that the forms are more lengthy than complex. Usually doctors feel that they're personally responsible, so they'll take a little bit more time, and because they're responsible for any inaccuracies that are found on these forms. Maybe we should just, like I mentioned before, maybe we should just consider changing the way the disability credit is administered instead of introducing more regulatory rules and making the forms more complex. Perhaps just have a simple one-pager and have a doctor's letter attached to it. That's maybe a consideration. Again, this would be something that the committee should study and find a way to make it easier and perhaps less cumbersome to administer. Again, as I was stating, as an accountant, my experience is that especially when the government introduced that you can go back and retroactively request a claim, a change to your income tax form for disability tax credit that went as far back as 10 years ago. The first year is normally the most complex time because even though you're using a software, you got to determine which credits, which deductions are eligible, which are more advantageous, because if you're claiming the disability tax credit, some other credits are not eligible. If you have dependents, you don't have dependents, so it's much more complex. So you want to make sure that the professional that's involved in producing or preparing a tax return or is giving advice to the individual is not being penalized because he or she has said, please go and get the disability tax credit certificate. The other problem that I found also as a professional was not, again, filling out the form, but having the form filled out on a timely basis. Normally, you give the form to your client or you give the form to the person that's representing the person that is potentially handicapped and is eligible for the disability tax credit. You go and see the doctor doesn't have time, puts it on his desk or her desk, and it takes forever to get it back. You've already filed the tax return or you've waited to file the tax return, and so it's, again, a timely issue more than something that's complex. So this is maybe another area that needs to be addressed. A lot of times the tax return, like I said, will be filed. The Revenue Department will come back and say we need more information. So again, it's the whole aspect that should be addressed. And when we address the fact of when the committee addresses the fact of the promoter fees, who should be paid for their time and how do you calculate that? I understand, and I saw that there was a formula. It's a little bit complex in the private member bill. But a professional, again, I'll use the example of an accountant, does not necessarily charge based on percentage because he's not allowed or she is not allowed to charge on a percentage basis. But how do you avoid an accountant charging based on the fact that somebody's going to get a $20,000 or $30,000 refund if that person is eligible to go back and amend their tax returns for the last 10 or 15 years. But I personally agree with the bill. I don't believe promoters should be taking advantage of the disabled. I don't believe that the promoters should be paid at all. But I guess there has to be a way to promote this initiative. But the government spends enough money on advertising. I don't see why we have to also pay promoters. So I am totally against this, and I'm hoping that the other members will also be against this in committee. But again, I'm totally shocked that this Conservative government is introducing more regulations. I understand the other reason for disability tax credits being very important is not just for individuals being eligible for the disability tax credit, but if you're eligible for the disability tax credit, even though you may not get money back on your tax return, you can open up a disability savings account. So that's very important. I've worked with a lot of people in my constituency. So again, I'm in favor of this bill, but as we've said it before, the Liberal Party is not necessarily in favor of these tax credits. We prefer having these tax credits refundable so that the people that actually need the money get the money. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm certainly pleased to stand up today and speak to this motion that my honourable colleague for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke has brought forward, and it's very important legislation. But I think perhaps before I start, I was actually very surprised to hear both some of the comments from the member from Victoria and also some of the comments from the member from St. Leonard, St. Michael. If you actually look at the application form, it is a small part that has to be done by the promoters. And actually, as someone that's experienced in the healthcare field, as I go through the section that the medical practitioners fill in, it's very logical. It's a very quite a simple form in terms of areas that are non-applicable and to really target in. So again, I find it actually surprising the comments that they've made in terms of the actual application process. We certainly know, and I've heard from many people in terms of the very responsiveness of CRA in terms of when they have any calls and how willing and able and quickly helpful they are in terms of dealing with any of these issues. So, you know, I don't know if they were trying to find areas of disagreement for disagreement's sake, but I think sometimes it would be nice just to look at what is a really good piece of private members' business, not government business, and to look at it in the spirit with which it was brought forward. So, you know, certainly our government understands Canadians have a difficult time making ends meet, and as a result, we offer a very generous range of tax credits. In fact, the tax credits are key to our economic action plan, a plan for jobs and growth that is working for Canadians as we face the global economic downturn. And I could go on at length in terms of some of those very important measures, whether it be the universal child care tax benefit or the home buyer's tax credit. These are very, very helpful, and I hear it every day in my office, how helpful people have found these measures in terms of supporting them. We continue, since we formed government, to lower taxes for hardworking Canadians, and the average family now pays $3,000 less in taxes each year. And we're certainly committed to enhanced participation for people with disabilities. Through our policies and programs, we support the full and equal involvement of those with disabilities in every aspect of Canadian life. And a key component of our strategy to assist the estimated 4 million Canadians with disabilities is the use of tax measures, particularly personal income tax provisions. As the House is aware, the Department of Finance is responsible for developing federal tax legislation in the areas of personal and corporate income tax. The Canada Revenue Agency administers this legislation and the various social and economic incentives delivered through the tax system. And one of the most important measures to help Canadians with disability is a disability tax credit. It recognizes that the cost of some disability-related expenses can affect an individual's ability to pay tax and provides a tax reduction to people with a severe and prolonged impairment in physical or mental function. Their disability must be severe enough to restrict them in their basic activities of daily living or cause a person to take an inordinate amount of time to perform such an activity, even with appropriate therapy, medication, and devices. The restriction must be expected to last for a continuous period of at least 12 months and must be present at least 90% of the time. Individuals may also be eligible under the cumulative effect of 2 or more restrictions, which in combination are present 90% of the time. And to claim this fund, affected individuals or families members caring for them need to complete the disability tax credit certificate. And we've talked about the process, we've talked about the form and how it certainly is a very sensible form with the section that looks at the impairment being filled in by a medical practitioner. And again, contrary to what the opposition say, I think it's very sensible and well laid out. And then also the very simple first page. Anyway, once that step is complete and the CRA confirms the person is eligible for the credit, the disability amount can be claimed on their income tax return. If for any reason someone with a disability or family member providing care needs assistance, we have agents that are actually specialized in the disability tax credit, and they're available to assist taxpayers and qualified practitioners by providing information on both the criteria and the application process. So readily available and very helpful in terms of moving forward. As Bill 462 underscores, however, Canadians with disabilities applying for the credit are not always treated fairly. In recent years, the Canadian Revenue Agency has witnessed an increase in the number of businesses promoting their services to individuals with disabilities and their families that want to apply for the DTC, or the disability tax credit. Often these businesses are focused primarily on completing the application form, and again, that's that early section, Part A, and they're charging up to 40% of the amount of the individual's income tax refund. So again, something that is very simple to do in terms of assisting, up to 40% and often thousands of dollars. Mr. Speaker, that can hardly be called fair, with people with disabilities receive as little as 60% of the amount that they're entitled to receive. In 2012, federal tax savings for someone who is eligible for the DTC will be up to $1,132 for adults, and it can be as much as $1,792 for a child under the age of 18, and or the family member supporting them. And of course, as we've mentioned already, these can be claimed retroactively, so thousands of dollars are at stake. For the 1 in 5 Canadians with disabilities living on low incomes, this can be a tremendous amount of money. And don't forget, the disabilities also are frequently an issue with seniors. So as I said from the outset, the Government of Canada is committed to ensuring that all Canadians are treated fairly by the tax system. The disability tax credit should be given to the person for whom it was intended. To make sure that happens, Bill C-462 will restrict the amount of fees that can be charged or accepted by businesses that request a determination of DTC eligibility on behalf of someone with a disability. And I think that's the key point, and it also again speaks to some of the members' concerns in terms of who this is targeting. It's not targeting practitioners, it's targeting the person who has submitted the form, the eligibility on the behalf. The legislation would prohibit firms from charging or accepting more than an established maximum fee, and that would be determined following consultations. So we certainly don't want to interfere with the fair market and free market and inadvertently hurt businesses that charge reasonable amounts consistent with the value of the services they provide. Our goal is simply to ensure that when Canadians with disabilities are eligible for the tax credit, especially if their claim goes back many years, they receive the maximum amount due to them. To discourage those companies that charge their clients more than a reasonable fee, Bill C-462 would require businesses to notify the CRA of any fee charged in excess of the maximum amount permitted. If they fail to do so, they would face fines of $1,000 to $25,000 for not notifying the CRA or for any false or deceptive statements. A separate fine equal to 100 to 200% of the excess fees could also be applied in addition to the penalty. Such fines would be applied in serious cases, such as repeat offenders. Mr. Speaker, there's very little to fault in this legislation, which is why it earns my endorsement with several small caveats. To enhance the bill's effectiveness, our government proposes 3 amendments. First, we want to strengthen the monetary value of the penalty so that it will represent more than just a return of profits. Without this amendment, the penalty as written could be perceived as an unacceptable business risk. We also want to make sure the provisions of the bill apply to all types of DC promoters and preparers, regardless of how their businesses is structured. And finally, we want to ensure that CRA is allowed to make full use of information at its disposal to identify non-compliance and to enforce the provision of the bills. With these improvements, Bill C-462 earns my wholehearted support, and I trust I can count on all members of Parliament to give their stamps of approval for this very worthy legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate. There are 8 minutes tonight for the honourable member for Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, I support this bill naturally because it seeks to prevent abuse by promoters of the disability tax credit by reducing the fees required by consultants for disabled persons applying for the DTC. So this is normal since many unscrupulous persons can attack the vulnerable. It is an important problem, and the growth of consultants has had for effect to lead to fraud, as demonstrated by a CBC report in 2011. However, it is my opinion that we need a study to clarify certain issues and close various loopholes. I can tell you at the outset that more information is necessary on the implementation of this bill. I'll get back to that. We must prevent abuse of the system by promoters, but we have to be aware that not all consultants abuse the system. There are 2 sides to this coin. First of all, some consultants can and will provide high-quality service to disabled Canadians who cannot apply for it without their help. So we have to make a distinction between promoters who abuse the system and those who act as consultants and truly help the disabled to obtain this tax credit that they would undoubtedly not been able to obtain on their own. Moreover, we also see that many promoters are swindlers who promise people that they'll be entitled to the disability tax credit even if their eligibility could be doubtful, while charging fees that go up to 40% of the benefits. This is a disgrace. Nothing can justify such fees, especially taken into account that these tax credits are retroactive and result in payments of thousands of dollars. Limiting the honoraria that can be invoiced by consultants is a good thing in order to prevent abuse of the disabled. Through this bill, promoters will be prohibited from requiring fees that go beyond the maximum that will be established by the Governor and Council. I'm sure you'll agree that this raises questions, and that is, how will the public and the promoters be informed, and when? There's also the exemption of certain promoters that leads to some questions about which promoters exactly would be exempted. Mr. Speaker, the other important question broached about the disability tax credit is that the people who apply also need the support of the government. This support is imperiled with the government's tax cutbacks to the CRA. Because of the lack of resources at the Canada Revenue Agency, it is unable to adequately inform the target audience for the DTC and the demand for briefings on the DTC. The cut in positions of regional program advisors is particularly harsh. There are wickets that are being closed, whereas citizens are used to seeing someone to give them further information. We must ensure that people who have a disability have equal access to the disability tax credit, which is not the case right now. The bill does not solve the problem of the deficiencies of the DTC, which are numerous, and that include the issue of accessibility of the DTC. The application process is complicated, and the tax credit remains difficult to get. The application process should be simplified. The reason why these crooked consultants prey on the vulnerable is because they know that the application process is complex. The terminology used and the definitions in the certificate are restrictive, unfair, and end up causing inconsistencies and even discrimination. The participants describe the process as difficult, long, and arduous. They have a lot of trouble understanding the form, and some don't even apply. They don't because they feel that it's a lost cause. Given that context, it's easy to understand that many turn to these consultants. Eligibility to the disability tax credits is not a significant alteration that prevents someone from taking part in daily life. Because of that, people with episodic disabilities or mental illnesses are often excluded because it's difficult for them to prove that their daily lives are significantly altered, either because that's the case on some days but not others, or because they're physically capable of exercising some activities but are not apt to do so mentally or emotionally. The evaluation criteria that are based on daily activities is problematic. That's a very restrictive and contradictory definition. It's contradictory because it does not comply with the provincial and territorial definitions to which practitioners refer, and to those of other programs, including that of the disability benefits under the Canada Pension Plan. The other problem is the fact that it depends on the understanding and goodwill of medical personnel who must fill out these forms. Qualified practitioners have trouble filling out the forms because of the complexity of some forms of disability and their evaluation according to the definition of the patient's daily activities. Some people were excluded simply because a doctor gave them bad advice based on an erroneous perception of the admissibility criteria, or eligibility criteria rather. Even when the forms are correctly filled out, the decision about who is accepted and who can be turned down seem arbitrary and unpredictable. Family support can exclude someone from the disability tax credit because that allows them to function at a higher level. The reliability of the certificate used to determine eligibility is therefore seriously called into question by many practitioners and participants. The tax credit was created to recognize part of the costs associated with a disability. It has become a prerequisite for almost all disability related programs at the federal level, such as the Disability Savings Plan. Therefore, many people with a disability are excluded from income security programs that would allow them to achieve a decent but modest income, to save for their future and reduce their stress. It is our duty to protect the financial security of all disabled persons, including those with low incomes. The programs in place don't work for those with episodic illnesses. You just have to look at the Canada Pension Plan disability benefits, the employment insurance benefits, all this. This means that these income support measures must work in order to provide real financial security to the disabled. To get back to the DTC, on the application certificate it says that to be eligible, a person must have a serious and extensive disability of physical or mental function for 12 continuous months. That excludes those with episodic illnesses. This is nothing new. It was raised in 2002 by the Liberal government. So I will close because I know my time is up. Having said this, I think that this bill is essential to solve the problem of the abuse of consultants, and it's a good first step, but an extensive study is still required. Thank you. The period for private members' business has now expired. The order is dropped to the bottom of the order paper. Pursuant to standing to order made on Thursday, January 31st, 2013, the House shall now resolve itself into Committee of the Whole to consider motion number 16 under government business. I do now leave the chair for the House to go into Committee of the Whole.